with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am your host, Scott Allen, and this is Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders. If the topic is leadership, I'm in. I've spent more than 20 years in the field teaching, learning, writing, and questioning. When I'm not working on Phronesis, I travel, delivering keynotes, working with individuals and teams, and helping people from organizations across industries become better leaders. Want to learn more? Visit me at scottjallen.net. Phronesis offers a smart, fast-paced discussion about all things leadership. We explore relevant topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. Listen Notes lists Phronesis in the top 3% of podcasts worldwide. Phronesis is the official podcast of the International Leadership Association. ILA brings together those who teach, study, and develop leadership, advancing leadership knowledge and practice for a better world. Learn more at ila-net.org. Finally, if you enjoy Phronesis, please subscribe to stay current on our weekly episodes. If you find an episode that resonates, please share it with your colleagues and friends. And if you want more content, subscribe to my newsletter, The Leader's Edge. The link is in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening. And now, here's today's show. Okay, everybody, welcome to the Phronesis podcast. Thank you so much for checking in. Today, I have two guests, and I'm very, very excited for this conversation. I have Dr. Nadir Zafar, and he is the Chief Experience Officer, or the CXO, of the Human Capital Leadership Institute. He joins HCLI from UAE-based education technology company, Aleph Education, where he was Chief Operating Officer. During his time, the company grew from a startup to an award-winning organization that serves several 100,000 students. Nadir graduated with a Bachelor of Business Management from the Pioneer Batch of the Singapore Management University and holds an MBA from INSEAD. He has also completed a Doctorate of Education and Leadership and Innovation at NYU in New York. His past and current leadership experience extends to serving on a board of London-listed global education company, president of the Singapore Business Council in UAE, alumni leader for both his alma maters, and founder of an edtech venture. Nadir is a Singaporean. We also have Dr. Michael Yap, and he is a dynamic and forward-thinking higher education leader known for his strategic prowess and ability to foster impactful collaborations. As the founding regional managing director of Coventry University Singapore Hub, he assumes the esteemed role of the university's most senior representative within the Asia region. Michael completed his doctorate in business administration at Coventry University in 2024. He took on a personal development journey showcasing his commitment to lifelong learning and intellectual growth. With a deep-seated understanding of Asia and UK education landscapes, Michael is adept at navigating complexities and building bridges between cultures. His extensive travels across Asia have honed his cross-cultural competencies, enabling him to drive meaningful change through effective global engagement. Michael Yap stands at the intersection of education, innovation, and collaboration, shaping a brighter future for academia and beyond. You know, Singapore is short on my list. It's a fascinating place in the world. And, the only island city-state in the world, about 5.5 million people. It's the most expensive city in the world, according to some sources in 2022. And so I think today we're going to go on this little bit of an adventure together, and you all are going to bring us up to speed with kind of some things that you see, some themes that you're seeing around leadership in Singapore. Now, before we do that, what do we need to know about you? Is there anything extra that you can share with us? Maybe, Nadir, we start with you. Anything else you want to share with listeners? Thank you for being here, sir.
Thanks a lot, Scott. I'm very passionate about the field of education and leadership, and I've been doing this now for a number of years. My job entails meeting with a lot of business and HR leaders, and so I hope to share some of the insights, not just from what I think, but from what I think they are telling me.
Awesome. Michael, sir, what else do people need to know about you?
Hi, Scott. Thank you for inviting me to this podcast. As you mentioned earlier, Singapore is one of the most expensive cities in the world. But in fact, it's not very true, depending on where you go. As Singapore brought up in Singapore, if you go to a local hawker center, it's relatively cheap. So I want to send that message out to the audience. We are not the most expensive city in the world. We are expensive, but affordable. Please come to Singapore.
Good. And Nadir, you want to jump in here too?
No, I second that. Absolutely. Come to Singapore because it's not as expensive as the media makes us out to be.
Good. Okay. Well, I'm glad that you all are already destroying myths. That's awesome. Well, gentlemen, let's talk about, and Nadir, you had mentioned kind of, okay, I'd love to share some themes, what I'm hearing from some of the leaders that I'm working with. And then Michael, maybe we can go to you as well. But Nadir, what are you hearing from leaders? What are some of the needs that are standing out in Singapore right now?
I think the topics that are discussed at the leadership levels in Singapore are not too dissimilar to those faced or discussed anywhere else in the world. And the three topics that I find come up most in conversations with both business and HR leaders are, number one, topics around ESG, the whole climate change, the whole transition, energy transition, things about sustainability. I mean, that usually takes up a lot of mind share among CEOs and CHROs. The second topic I see that is very often discussed is anything at all to do with generative AI technology, the digital transformation, and how that has an impact on business and on the company's operating model. And the third theme I see emerging from my conversations is really about people. And, the people matters. It's a huge subject which covers diversity and equity and inclusion, things about remote work, things about how we can get best people to join our company. How do we retain, attract, and develop talent? So I would say these three topics, ESG, AI, and people matters, typically are very much thought about by leaders in Singapore.
Okay. And so, Michael, I want to check in with you, and then let's go deep into, each one of those. Michael, are you seeing anything that you'd like to add to this list that are hot topics for individuals that you're interfacing with? Anything else come to mind?
I think maybe my angle comes from the education sector and with the business community. I think what we are seeing right now is there's a challenge in terms of training our youth to become better leaders, especially in the context of the Singapore environment. I mean, we are a small country, as you mentioned earlier. We have 5 million, now it's 6.6 million people in Singapore.
Okay.
30% of these people are foreigners working in Singapore. That means the values of being a leader here, you need to be having a global mindset. You also need to understand working with people from different culture. So I think Singapore, although it's a small country, but we are very diverse. We meet our different group of people. So in that sense, having the understanding of what Nadir mentioned, ESG, correct, talent development, I think all these areas are important. But I think at the same time, as a Singaporean leader in Singapore, you cannot behave as a Singaporean. You must behave as a global leader, thinking wider perspective of the different people in Singapore right now and having the behavior to be able to lead and engage them.
I love it. Okay. So, and I think, training youth to be effective and prepared leaders, and do they have that global mindset? Do they have that cultural intelligence? And okay, so let's actually start there. Let's start there. When we talk about training youth, what do you see? What themes are emerging when it comes to, because my sense is that culturally, there are some differences between all countries, but what are some attributes of effective leadership that are highly valued in Singapore? What are some things that come to mind for you there? When we talk about developing leaders, what does that look like?
I think you're right. Youth today are very different from youth in our days. Correct. I come from a very traditional education system. My parents tell me either become an engineer or be a doctor or be someone who can lead an organization. But I think the youth today are not looking towards that. I think the Gen Z, we call them, they might want to be leaders, assuming. At the same time, they want something that's carefree. And I think technology is playing a big part into this right now. So I believe educating youth and training them, we need to put a lot of effort to understand what they need. and put them in a position whereby they have opportunity to learn and to excel, at the same time to grow their dreams. I think these are all very important facts of training a youth as they develop the time in their career.
Yeah. Nadir, how do you think about that?
One of the things I do at the Human Capital Leadership Institute is I lead a national movement called the Singapore Leaders Network. And our whole mission is about preparing Singaporeans for global leadership roles. And one of the things, while we don't necessarily do leadership development for youth, one of the things we do is we develop middle to senior level leaders. And what we're seeing is that the values of a leader in Singapore, while very good, and which I think mirror the values across Asia, may not necessarily be applicable in the Western context wholesale.
Sure.
And let me give you an example of that. While in Singapore and most parts of Asia, there is a certain element of humility that is much admired in this culture, where we tend not to challenge authority or try to disrupt the status quo. Again, this is an overly broad generalization, but there is a tendency to not make others lose face, so to speak. Now, when we look at getting on a global stage, there is a lot more value put into being assertive, sharing one's ideas, no matter how divergent they are. And I think this is something that we need to be able to develop, an ability to adapt our skills for a global MNC or global audience. And that's, I would say, something that we have observed through the leadership development work we've done. There are a couple of things other than the ability to communicate differently that we've also observed. And one of them is about having the ability to navigate complexity.
Yeah.
Particularly in Singapore, where business is very transparent and it's one of the best places in the world to do business. We find that because it's quite an easy place relative to other countries to do business, when we get outside of the country, we have to be able to navigate chaos, complexity. It's something we need to develop better.
Well, my understanding and my impression has always been that, and again, please push back if my impressions are off, but it's a very orderly society in many ways, that there's a lot of structure about how we exist and how we behave and how we interact. And I think that's incredible. And to your point, when we get outside of that context, that contextual intelligence of, can I shift gears? And this may be an instance where now I need to assert myself a little bit more aggressively or my position a little bit more. And so I think, are we ambidextrous from a contextual intelligence standpoint? I think that's brilliant. I mean, does that capture it somewhat?
Yes, somewhat. It is captured in what you're saying. The ability to be ambidextrous is very important. We in Singapore are blessed to have a mix of Western and Eastern influences in the workplace. While we carry the Eastern values, we also have the Western pragmatism when it comes to doing business. And that puts us at an advantage when it comes to the global stage. And so what we do with the Singapore Leaders Network is really try and drive home that sense of being able to adapt, being able to shift gears, as you said, and navigate these different markets with a lot more confidence.
Awesome. Michael, I know that you have something to say here as well.
Yeah, I think just want to add to what Nadia has said. It is very true because we have that Western influence, the Asian culture. At the same time, we are brought in the traditional way of living in Singapore. So as you're aware, Singapore is multiracial. We brought in different environment. I think at the same time, what I'm seeing right now is because I'm very exposed to the British education system and the Singapore education system. Many a times you look at Singaporeans, we tend to be a bit more passive. We tend to keep to ourselves. We are shy away from asking questions. Trust me to this, Scott, if you come to Singapore, if you go to an auditorium, who grew up Singaporean, you ask any questions, the room will be quiet most of the time. You got to encourage them to speak out. But whereas if you are in the Western environment, People are raising hands, people are asking questions, and that's the environment that's so much different here. I think what the Singapore system, the education system is trying to encourage is kids to speak up, learn to face a different environment, be more independent. And I think that's the reason why the Ministry of Education in Singapore is encouraging all the higher education institutions in Singapore to send their kids overseas for internship, for job placement. I think that's the time whereby they can expose themselves to different environment. It might sound funny, why are we pushing our kids out there? But the more we push them out there in a different environment, staying in India for 3 months, they will know water don't come easily. Correct? The thought attack water won't be there. I think it's the kind of environment that we want to train our youth to learn, to survive. I would say I won't use to survive, but adapt to different environment. And to me, that's a very good learning experience for everyone.
That's beautifully said. Beautifully said, Nadir.
We all know that resilience is the most valued trait of a leader, but it's easier said than done. Building resilience takes getting out of your comfort zone, getting into the rough and tough world out there, getting into the gritty parts of the world, and really going through a bit of suffering, because that's when you build your character, your resilience. And that's what we need more Singaporeans to do, is to get out there to the region, to the world, and see how business is done. And, that's something that thankfully more Singaporeans are doing. And they come back with new ideas. They come back stronger for the experiences that they've gone through. And I speak with conviction because I've worked in India, I've worked in Dubai, I've worked in Abu Dhabi, I did a stint in Bangkok. And so I know that doing business in Singapore, however beautiful and orderly and transparent and wonderful it is, it's actually an anomaly when it comes to doing business, because the rest of the world operates on a very different model, something which we Singaporeans have to understand better.
Yes. But I wish it was more like what you're describing.
I guess if we are only imbibed in this environment, we come to believe that this is the only way that business is done.
Yes.
And that's why I strongly encourage for more people to get out and do business in other parts of the world, because then we realize that, hey, you know what? There are other ways of business being done.
Well, I think there's just a really interesting, I think it's Vygotsky who said the zone of proximal development, that we're in that Goldilocks zone of we're being challenged. And what you're saying here is like, look, get outside of the country, see what else exists in the world, understand that, again, become a little bit ambidextrous. And depending on the context, can we shift gears for what's appropriate in this situation? But we're going to have to challenge ourselves and push ourselves to get out there. I just hope, I hope, and I imagine the two of you would agree that the country, it's a both and. We value who we are and what we stand for. And I mean, because that's such a special element of the country. And when we need to shift, we can. I mean, there's this both and there, Nadir.
Absolutely. And let me say that we Singaporeans are blessed to have an advantage because we're a multiracial society, people of Indian origin, people of Chinese origin. And those are the two biggest countries in Asia. And so we've got somewhat of an understanding of dealing with two of the largest countries or cultures in the world. And I think that puts us in a very good stead when it goes to working in such countries outside of Singapore. We got to use that advantage. We've got to take advantage of that.
Exactly. And Michael, so what are you seeing from a kind of a British Singaporean? Talk about that a little bit, because I think that has to be fascinating as well.
Well, I hope whatever I say, I will not lose my job. If I do that, Scott will hire me.
We haven't had anyone lose their job yet on the podcast. Don't start, please.
No, joking. I think, again, as a Singaporean working for a UK organization, culture definitely is very different. First of all, I think the UK way of doing things a bit, I won't say they're slow, but they're a bit more patient, correct, in responding to things. But Singaporeans, the word that we use of ourselves, we are the chop kind. We want to get things done as quickly as possible. Okay, we don't wait for tomorrow. We're very anxious. So I think there's a difference in culture of getting things done. I think at the same time, I do have Singapore colleagues working with me, and when they deal with the UK colleagues, at times they are not able to communicate well because the UK staff expect us to speak up, but the Singaporeans tend to keep to themselves. So it's always when they encounter a problem, they'll come to me, oh, Michael, I have this problem. Can we share with them? I say, why don't you speak directly? I think the fear of making somebody feel uncomfortable and the fear of saying the wrong thing causes that miscommunication at times. So again, it is a different culture set. I think it's also very important is to having the understanding of both culture. I used to tell my UK colleagues, guys, it's not we understanding you. You have to understand us because for us to work together, it's not only one way around. It must be both ways. And this is very important.
But I think the two of you are emerging something that's super important. I mean, I love the content of cognitive biases. I love that content. And I think, Nadir, you had said a little bit earlier, like, look, we're in this complexity. And if you think about the global stage right now, we've got geopolitical shifts. We have digital shifts. We have climate shifts. We have all of these macro shifts that are occurring. And the complexity is just mind-boggling. And it seems to me that in organizational life, how we navigate some of that complexity is by getting in a room, making some shared sense of what these different vantage points see, and then we, with our best guess, kind of chart a path forward. But if we're in a culture where no one feels like, or aren't used to, I should say, speaking up, letting us know what they see, then that can leave some leaders, I think, really hanging out there. And also it puts an incredible amount of pressure on those leaders to come up with solutions to problems that don't have solutions. So I think what you're talking about is and I think what I love about leader development and where the panacea for me, and again, this isn't, maybe I overstated panacea, but one vision I would have is that we better prepare people to work with intentionality and the ability to switch gears depending on the context, like a golfer would choose a different club depending on the context, and for them to work with intentionality and know when to fall in line and, go with the authority figure, when to speak up and how to do so respectfully and how to get their voice into the space. So it seems like such a just wonderful opportunity.
We've talked a lot about culture, and I want to bring up another factor in this situation. It's education. And I think this is a subject that Michael will be very interested to discuss as well. But let me just specify and preface this. When I say education, I'm talking about not university. I'm talking about the early school years. See, in our education system in Singapore, and it's changing for the better, but it has traditionally been very focused on getting the academic results. It has been very efficient in the way the education is delivered at schools, which means that questions and discussions are somewhat less emphasized over the actual delivery of teaching material. Again, I'm generalizing and things are changing, but through the education, at least from the way I was brought up, my education system did not really give me the space to speak up. It was more of like, get this done. Don't speak unless spoken to. It was a different, I would say, type of education that we get in other parts of the world. And so that may have played a part in the way we've developed as leaders. Now, things are changing. And at university level, I can tell you, Singapore has got some of the best universities in the world.
Yes.
And it's got a very robust system of class discussions that happens at university level. But in the school years, there's not so much of that. And so I guess that's played a part, that and cultural upbringing, in the way we've developed as leaders. Now, that said, I want to emphasize again, Singapore's advantages are that we are in a multiracial society where we've got a lot of exposure to working with two of the biggest cultures in the world. We have Western and Eastern influences in our workplace, which is a great learning ground for us. And we've got people of integrity, or at least people with the perceived integrity. And that's something that really stands out, is that when you think of Singapore, you think of a country where there's no corruption or very little of it. And you have people who believe in doing things in a very straight and proper way. So these three things put Singaporeans in a very good stead at the global leadership stage.
Interesting, Nadia brought this up about the school years. I mean, for me, I look at it also in a different way. I think a lot of this education depends on the parents, how we bring up the kids. I give a very simple example, Scott. In the US, I believe you let your kid run barefoot in the grass field, run outside there freely on the sand. But in Singaporean, if a kid do this way, immediately the mother bring her up, put on her shoes because she's worried that the legs will get dirty. That happens. Correct.
Yes.
So again, it's different environment, but the parents tend to be overly protective. They don't let the kids try. To be honest, I think Nadia and myself, in our younger days, we run around barefooted all over the place. But today, I don't see any kids doing that anymore. I think that is the way we bring people up. So I think parents play a very important part in educating. Schools plays a very important part. But ultimately, I feel the way we educate our youth nowadays is also very important in the sense that giving them a chance to try, learn to fail, and learn to explore. Those are very important facts of life. And having that soft skills, as well, I mentioned, intentional. What do we do? There must be a purpose when we learn something, not just for the grades, but to learn something. Because nowadays AI is so powerful. Today, I want to do my podcast with you. I go ChatGPT, they'll come out all the points for me. Correct. But I think the area of importance is really that soft skill. How to speak to people, how to communicate, how to be flexible, and how as time to solve problems. Critical solving skills, these are all areas of importance from the way we are moving ahead.
I love it. I love it. Nadir, anything you want to add to that?
I agree with what Michael said. I think the parents and the way they bring up the kids plays a large part in the development of one's skills and abilities and the way they think. Parents today, and not just in Singapore, but actually around the world in general, are much more overly protective of their kids. And I think that's created what they call a strawberry generation. I've heard that term only recently. What it means is a generation of people who may not be as strong. Now, I don't think it applies in Singapore generally. I think our kids are quite resilient and strong, especially having gone through the most intense academic experience at an early start of their schooling life. They're used to the pressure. But in general, compared to when Michael and I were much younger, I think we probably went through a bit more hardship than the kids today. And so that has helped us older folks be a little bit more resilient and strong, whereas the younger folks may find things a little bit tougher than us, the older folks.
Well, and to back to your point, if they haven't been exposed to even then some of the realities of how things work elsewhere in the world, then that has to be incredibly surprising. They can find themselves flat-footed. And I mean, I have great respect for the work that the two of you are doing. And again, this both and I see in my mind of we have strong values that guide our work and who we are and what we stand for and the really, really good that exists within our country. And again, you're building a generation of individuals that can play in those other contexts and have that awareness and that ability. I think that's just beautiful. I really do. Because then when you get to these other contact conversations around, because, to your point at the very beginning, Nadir, what are you seeing? Well, we're seeing ESG, we're seeing generative AI and all the other technologies enabling disruption. We're seeing people and some of the challenges around those are all complex adaptive challenges. That's not easy work that is solved cleanly.
That's so true.
Well, anything else you all want to talk about as we kind of begin to wind down our time? We've almost been going for about 40 minutes. So what do you think?
Just to add, I think the environment that we are in Singapore, I think it's also very important for future leaders to understand how to work around it. Because the fact is, kids are being brought up this way, the education is this way, although we are changing. But the fact that somebody who's in the workforce today, who can become an assistant manager, are dealing not just with Singaporeans, but foreigners in Singapore. You can't run away from that. So I think at the onset, as a young leader, you have to expect to make mistakes, correct? And learn how to work with different group of people from different culture, different background, different understanding of language. It doesn't mean that everyone speaks English. Maybe we speak Singlish, you might not understand. We speak local dialects, you might not understand. So having the understanding is critical. Again, I'm speaking from my own experience as a board member of the British Chamber of Commerce. I deal with a lot of the British community. When they come to Singapore, they might not understand how to work in Singapore also. Correct. So I think it's that cultural exposure themselves to know how to do well in Singapore. Vice versa, Singaporeans also need to adapt working with people from different nationality. And I think that understanding is very important for us to grow together as a young leader and willing to try. To me, that's important.
And I loved that. You're modeling in some ways your bio where it says collaboration. This is a two-way, and are we working together, and are we honoring one another? I love it. Nadir?
I absolutely agree with what Michael said. In fact, the whole mission of the Human Capital Leadership Institute is to develop leaders and leadership in Asia. And we see that there's a big need in the market for us to educate people about practices in business and leadership in this part of the world, because it's not the same as in the Western part of the world. Leadership in general is more often than not taught from a very Western angle. And where we see the gap is to know that, in Asia, particular culture plays a large part, education plays another part, and the nuances of Asia are something that we have to be much better adept at. So while we were talking earlier in this conversation, in this podcast, about how Asians or Singaporeans need to be able to adapt to the Western environment, there is also a great need for Westerners to understand how to do business in this part of the world. The whole thing about respecting elders, about saving face, about letting people speak uninterrupted and not not having that sort of robust discussions that you expect in a different environment. I think that it's interesting. And we also have to break the myth of Asia being a monolithic, homogenous sort of a culture. It's not. Even within India, for example, there's probably about 30, 40 different types of ways of doing business, just because there's so many different states and different languages. So I think that's where we come in very passionately to share with the world about leadership practices here. And that's what keeps me very excited about what I do.
I love it. Michael?
Actually, I'm very glad you invited both of us to this podcast to learn more about Singapore. But I think hopefully with our messages to the Western world, my message to all of them is please understand us and adapt to the Asian way. I think that, again, based on leadership studies, a lot has been done in the West, correct? But leadership study in the East, there are not a lot. They are in Chinese, which many people cannot read. But I think it's important for the Westerners to understand the way to work, the way to lead in the Eastern environment. Because Southeast Asia is going to be a big growing market right now. So I think for them to have the understanding and listening to people like ourselves to share more about Singaporean or Singapore or the way to work in this region is, to me, is very useful and beneficial.
Great.
In the past, to be a global leader, it was enough to understand how to do business in the West. But today, that's no longer the case. Today, in order to be a global leader, you have to know Asia, because Asia makes up a large part of the world economy and it's the biggest market. So I think that's why the importance of learning leadership in Asia takes on a much higher importance today than ever before. And so like Michael was saying, I think it's very important that people put in the time and effort to understand our part of the world and the way we do business. And so I'm really looking forward to spreading the message from this part of the world.
I think it's beautifully said. And whether it's what you just said or Michael's previous statement of, look, this goes both ways. And it's not just Singaporeans becoming culturally and contextually intelligent. It's people from the West valuing that and prioritizing that as well. And we might just find ourselves left behind if we aren't on this side of the house, quote unquote, Earth. I'm using Earth as a house. It's true. In many ways, probably deserved if we don't take the time to really work to build that on the Western side as well, that understanding and that collaboration. So thank you so much, gentlemen. This was exactly what I was hoping we would get to. And I think we will have a lot of links in the show notes. So for listeners, if you'd like to learn a little bit more, not only about these two gentlemen, but also about their work and some other nuances, we will have resources for you in the show notes. So please check those out. Now, gentlemen, I always close out the podcast by asking what's caught your attention in recent times? What have you been reading or listening to, or maybe you've been streaming something? But it could have to do with what we've just discussed. It may have nothing to do with what we've just discussed. But what's something that's really caught your attention? What do you think? Michael?
Coincidentally, I was watching a CNA documentary about our founder, Lee Kuan Yew, in his own words. So that is a very good documentary and talking about the Singapore story and the way he leads Singapore to where it is today. I think that is a very good documentary. I encourage anyone in the podcast to go to the video and take a look. It can be found on YouTube. I think that's very useful to have an understanding also.
Wonderful. I will put that in the show notes for sure. Nadir, what's caught your attention?
Well, I'm going to just build on what Michael said, because I think Lee Kuan Yew would be the embodiment of a global leader that's come from Singapore. And we don't have that many examples. I think the CEO of TikTok is one of those global leaders. Of course, we have a number of others, but Lee Kuan Yew definitely is the most famous there is. And we as Singaporeans should strive to get on that global stage because of all the advantages we've got as a small country, having one of the most competitive workplaces in the world, one of the best educated workforces, having that multiracial society where we've practiced working with people across two of the largest cultures in the world, where we've got a lot of Western influence and Eastern influence in which to understand. I think there is a lot of opportunity for Singaporeans to get out there and get on the global stage.
Well, and in so many ways, I mean, it's a wonderful model of what can be. Again, whether it's many, many cultures existing and doing work together and trying to understand a model education system in many ways, not perfect, but I mean, there's so many strengths. And, you know, gentlemen, I'm just very, very thankful for not only the work you're doing, but then also thankful for this conversation I've learned. And that's my favorite thing about this podcast is it's really just kind of me learning in public. And you've helped me learn today. And I very, very much appreciate that. We'll do it again. And I might be seeing either one or both of you in Chicago in November for the International Leadership Association. So hopefully that will be the case. And I can buy you a pint or a cup of coffee, whatever you prefer. So, or tea.
That'd be good.
Wonderful.
Take care. Be well.
Okay. For me, the practical wisdom, cultural intelligence. And this was a wonderful opportunity for me to learn about some of the unique aspects of the dialogue around leadership in Singapore. So thankful for these two gentlemen and sharing their wisdom, sharing their observations. And again, are you curious, humbly curious about how things are elsewhere? And are you learning? And for me, that cultural intelligence is just critical as a leader. So everyone, as always, thank you so much for checking in. Thanks for listening. And I hope you have a great week. Bye-bye. You have just finished another episode of Practical Wisdom for Leaders with Scott Allen. To contact me, visit scottjallen.net or send me a note at scott@scottjallen.net. I'm also on LinkedIn, so let's connect. If you have feedback, I'd love to hear it. And as always, thank you so much for listening. And now here's my daughter, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.